Some people enter MIT through academic brilliance, others through family connections. And then there are people like David Chen who walk the hallways every night with nothing but a flashlight, a security badge, and mathematical dreams he had, buried so deep that even he sometimes forgot they existed. Before we jump into this incredible story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled outside the windows of MIT's Data Center, that architectural marvel of tilted walls and unexpected angles that house some of the most brilliant minds in computer science and mathematics. Outside, snow began to blanket Cambridge in silence, transforming the December night into a soundless world where even footsteps became whispers. It was 2:47 a.m., and David Chen was midway through his overnight security shift. David was 34, though the lines etched around his eyes made him look older, not from age, but from the weight of deferred dreams and the fatigue of working two jobs. The security uniform hung loosely on his lean frame, a navy blue reminder of how far his life had veered from where he once thought it would go. His movements through the building were practiced and efficient. After 5 years of patrolling these same corridors, he could navigate them blindfolded, knew every corner where shadows gathered, every supply closet, every squeaky floorboard. Most security guards hated the overnight shift, the emptiness, the silence, the way time seemed to stretch like taffy, pulling minutes into hours, but David preferred it. During the day, MIT pulsed with energy. Students rushing between classes, professors gesturing animatedly about concepts most people would never understand. Researchers huddled over laptops arguing about algorithms and theories that might change the world. The daytime MIT was a painful reminder of a path David had once believed would be his. At night, though, the building belonged to him, just him and the equations. The starter center housed multiple departments, but the mathematics wing was David's sanctuary. During his rounds, he would often pause outside classroom doors, peering through small windows at chalkboards, still covered in formulas from the day's lectures. Sometimes, if he was certain no one was around, he would slip inside, just to stand closer to those elegant strings of numbers and symbols. He never touched anything, never altered a single digit, but he read them, absorbed them, worked through them in his mind as he continued his patrol. Tonight was different, though. As David made his way down the fourth-floor corridor, he noticed light spilling from beneath the door of room 456, Professor William Kaplan's advanced theoretical mathematics classroom. This was unusual. The cleaning staff had finished hours ago, and even the most dedicated students rarely stayed past midnight. David approached cautiously, keyring jingling softly against his thigh. Through the small rectangular window he could see the room was empty of people, but the lights were on, and all three of the massive chalkboards were covered in dense mathematical notation. Someone had obviously forgotten to turn off the lights and clean the boards. He should have simply unlocked the door, flipped the light switch, and continued his rounds. That would have been the proper protocol. Instead, he found himself slipping. Inside, drawn to the equations that sprawled across the green-black surface like some complex mathematical tapestry. The problem was beautiful. A series of partial differential equations dealing with what appeared to be a complex topology problem. David recognized Professor Kaplan's distinctive handwriting, the way he formed his integrals with an extra flourish, the particular notation he used for his matrices. This was clearly part of the professor's latest research, something cutting edge and unresolved. And there, at the bottom right corner of the third board, David could see where the work had stalled. A circled question mark, a notation that something wasn't adding up. The professor had hit a wall. Without conscious thought, David found himself picking up a piece of chalk. The weight of it in his hand felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. He hesitated, chalk poised inches from the board. He shouldn't be doing this. It wasn't his place. He could lose his job. But the equations called to him with an almost physical pull. He could see the path forward, a different approach using an obscure transform technique he'd read about years ago in a Russian mathematics journal. His hand began to move, almost of its own volition, adding careful notations to the side of Kaplan's work, not erasing or changing anything, but offering an alternative path. Time slipped away as David worked, lost in the elegant dance of mathematics, where everything else, his job, his fatigue, the cold Boston night, faded to insignificance. This was the only place he had ever felt truly at home, truly himself. In the language of mathematics, there was no judgment, no barriers of class or circumstance, only the pure beauty of logic and structure. He didn't hear the door open. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The voice, sharp, authoritative, outraged, sliced through David's mathematical trance. The chalk slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor as he spun around, heart hammering against his ribs. Professor William Kaplan stood in the doorway, his tall frame rigid with anger, silver-streaked hair disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. At 57, he was one of the most respected mathematicians in the country, with a reputation for brilliant research and an equally formidable temper. His piercing grey eyes moved from David's security uniform to the chalkboard behind him, narrowing dangerously. "I asked you a question," Kaplan said, his voice low and controlled now, which somehow seemed more threatening than if he'd shouted. "Are you defacing my work?" David's mouth went dry. "No, sir, I noticed a potential solution path for the topology constraint in your third equation set." The professor's eyebrows shot up, more in disbelief than acceptance. He strode forward, briefcase still clutched in one hand, and scanned the additions to his work. For a long, excruciating moment, he said nothing, eyes moving systematically across David's notations. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Where did you learn Osipov's transform technique? It's not exactly common knowledge." David swallowed hard. "I read about it in a translated article from the Moscow Mathematical Journal about 8 years ago." "And you? What? Memorized it after one reading?" There was naked skepticism in Kaplan's tone. "Yes, sir." David didn't elaborate, didn't explain that he remembered everything he read, that numbers and formulas embedded themselves in his mind with perfect clarity. That had always been both his gift and his curse. Kaplan set his briefcase down on the nearest desk with a deliberate motion. He moved closer to the board, examining David's work with greater intensity. This isn't the work of someone who casually read an article. These extensions of the proof structure. His voice trailed off as he followed the logic. This is the work of someone with extensive training. David remained silent. What could he say? That mathematics had once been his entire life? That circumstances, not ability, had taken him off that path? That some nights, when his apartment was quiet and his roommates asleep, he still worked through problems he found online from MIT's open courseware, just to feel alive. Name? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kaplan demanded, turning to face him directly. "David Chen, sir. Not your security badge, your full academic background." David hesitated, then sighed. There was no point in lying. "I completed 3 years at the University of Michigan. Mathematics major with a minor in theoretical physics. I had to leave before finishing my degree." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. David's jaw tightened. It wasn't a story he shared often, not even with co-workers he'd known for years, but something in Kaplan's intense gaze compelled honesty. "My father died suddenly my junior year. heart attack. He left significant medical debt, and my mother was already sick with multiple sclerosis. My younger brother was still in high school. Someone had to support the family. So I left school, took whatever jobs I could find. The words came out flat, emotionless, a practiced recitation of facts that didn't reveal how those choices had torn him apart. Kaplan's expression didn't soften, but something in his eyes shifted. And you ended up here, at MIT, as security staff. A bitter smile touched David's lips. Ironic, right? Closest I could get to where I wanted to be. The professor turned back to the chalkboard, following the elegant thread of David's mathematical reasoning. How long have you been doing this? Coming into classrooms after hours? David's heart sank. This was it. He was about to be fired, possibly even charged with trespassing or tampering. I just look at the work. I've never written on a board before. Tonight. I don't know what came over me. I apologize, Professor Kaplan. It won't happen again. Kaplan ignored the apology, still studying the equations. You're working security, but you're keeping up with cutting-edge mathematical theory in your spare time. There was something like reluctant respect in his voice now. Why? The question was so unexpected that David answered with unfiltered honesty. Because it's the only thing that makes sense to me, the only language where I feel fluent. He gestured helplessly. I can't not do it. The professor turned, fixing David with an evaluating stare that felt like it was peeling away layers, seeing past the security uniform to something underneath. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy. Finally, Kaplan picked up the eraser and David's heart sank. Of course, the professor would erase his presumptuous additions. Who was he to think? But Kaplan didn't erase David's work. Instead, he cleared a section of the adjacent board and wrote a new equation. Complex, multi-layered, with variables and constraints that would challenge any graduate student. Solve it, Kaplan said simply, holding out a piece of chalk. David stared at the professor, then at the board, then back again. Now? Yes, now. Unless you have more pressing security matters to attend to at 3 in the morning? There was a challenge in Kaplan's eyes that ignited something in David that had been dormant for too long. He took the chalk, turned to the board, and began to work. The problem was elegant but tricky, requiring multiple approaches and a careful handling of boundary conditions. David worked steadily, methodically, occasionally murmuring to himself as he pushed through particularly challenging sections. He was dimly aware of Kaplan watching him, of the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, of the occasional shuffle as the professor moved to observe from a different angle. 23 minutes later, David placed the final bracket around his answer and stepped back. His hand ached pleasantly from the unaccustomed activity, chalk dust coating his fingers, and he suspected smudged across his face where he'd absently rubbed during a moment of concentration. Kaplan studied the completed solution, making a small sound in the back of his throat that might have been surprise or approval. He picked up another piece of chalk and made a single correction to David's work, a minor term that didn't affect the final result. Careless, Kaplan commented, but there was no heat in the word. Yes, sir, David agreed, spotting the error immediately once it was pointed out. I should have caught that. Kaplan set the chalk down with a decisive click and turned to face David fully. Mr. Chen, do you know what I was doing back in my office at this ungodly hour? David shook his head, uncertain where this was going. I was reviewing applications, MIT's Pure Mathematics Fellowship, full tuition, generous stipend, guaranteed research position. Kaplan crossed his arms. I've been on the selection committee for 15 years, and I've never seen a more dismal batch of candidates. Technically proficient, certainly, but without that spark, that intuitive leap that separates the good from the exceptional. He gestured toward the board where David's solution glowed white against the dark surface. And then I walk in here and find a security guard with apparently no formal graduate education, solving a topology problem that has stumped my research team for 2 months. David remained silent, not trusting himself to speak. His heart was beating too fast, hope and suspicion warring in his chest. Tomorrow, or rather today, since it's nearly 4 in the morning, I want you in my office at noon, room 542. Bring whatever documentation you have from your undergraduate studies. Transcripts, papers, anything. Kaplan's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Am I in trouble, sir? David finally asked. Kaplan actually laughed at that, a short, sharp sound. Mr. Chen, you've been secretly working on advanced mathematics problems for years while patrolling these halls. The only trouble you're in is with yourself for wasting that mind of yours on checking door locks and writing up parking violations. He collected his briefcase and headed for the door, then paused, hand on the knob. Noon, Mr. Chen. Don't be late. Then he was gone, leaving David standing alone in the classroom, chalk dust on his hands and an impossible hope blooming in his chest for the first time in years. The rest of David's shift passed in a blur. He completed his rounds mechanically, his mind replaying the encounter with Professor Kaplan over and over, analyzing every word, every expression, searching for hidden meanings or misunderstandings. By the time he punched out at 6 a.m., exhaustion had caught up with him, but sleep was impossible. He walked home through the early morning stillness, the sun just beginning to paint Cambridge in pale gold. His apartment was empty. His roommate, Jorge, already gone for an early shift at the hospital where he worked as an orderly. David showered quickly, washing away chalk dust and the night's surreal events. As the hot water pounded against his shoulders, he allowed himself to really remember, the person he had been before necessity reshuffled his priorities. The undergraduate who stayed up all night solving problems just for the joy of it. The student whose professors had pulled him aside to say, "You have a gift, David, don't waste it." And the young man who had believed, with the certainty of youth, that mathematics would be his life's work. He leaned his forehead against the cool tile of the shower wall. What was Kaplan planning? Was this some elaborate way to fire him, to make an example of him for tampering with university property? Or could it possibly be something else? Hope was dangerous. Hope had been carefully excised from his expectations years ago when he'd packed up his dorm room at Michigan, leaving behind textbooks he couldn't afford to keep and dreams he couldn't afford to chase. Allowing it to flicker back to life now seemed like an invitation to pain. David toweled off and dressed carefully in the best clothes he owned, dark slacks and a blue button-up shirt that was slightly too large, a remnant from when he'd had the time and money to eat regular meals. He gathered what meager academic documentation he still possessed, a dog-eared transcript showing a 397 GPA before his abrupt departure, a few graded papers he'd kept for sentimental reasons, and a letter of recommendation for a prestigious summer research program he'd never been able to attend. It wasn't much. It certainly wasn't the kind of portfolio that would impress someone like William Kaplan, whose office walls were undoubtedly lined with awards and accolades. But it was all he had. At 11:15, David left his apartment and began the familiar walk. To MIT, the same route he took for his evening shifts, though it felt strange to make the journey in daylight. The campus was busy now, alive with students rushing between classes, laughing in small clusters on the quad, their voices bright with the privileges of youth and opportunity. David felt profoundly out of place. In his security uniform, he was invisible to these students, part of the background machinery that kept their educational experience running smoothly. But today, in civilian clothes, he felt like an imposter, a trespasser in a world that had rejected him. He arrived at the Mathematics building 20 minutes early. His stomach knotted with tension. The elevator ride to the 5th floor seemed interminable. When he finally stepped out, the hallway stretched before him, doors on either side bearing the names of mathematics luminaries whose papers he'd studied in stolen moments between shifts. Room 542 was at the end of the corridor. Professor William Kaplan, department chair, was inscribed on a polished brass plate. David stood outside, gathering his courage, watching the second hand of his watch tick inexorably toward noon. At exactly 12, he knocked. "Enter," called a familiar voice. David pushed open the door and stepped into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and windows that overlooked the Charles River. The room smelled of old books and coffee, and unlike the precise order of the equation-filled chalkboards, Kaplan's office was a controlled chaos of papers, journals, and mathematical models. The professor himself sat behind a massive oak desk, reading glasses perched low on his nose as he studied something on his computer screen. He looked up when David entered, gesturing to a chair across from him without preamble. "You're punctual. Good. I despise lateness." He removed his glasses and set them aside. "Sit." David sat, placing his slim folder of documents on his lap. For a long moment, Kaplan simply studied him, as if he were another equation to be solved. David forced himself to meet that penetrating gaze without flinching. "I've spent the morning making some calls," Kaplan said finally. "University of Michigan. Your former professors. Most have retired or moved on, but I managed to track down Dr. Eliana Ruiz. Do you remember her?" David's breath caught. "Yes, sir. She was my advisor. Advanced theory of computation." Kaplan nodded. "She remembers you quite vividly. Used some rather colorful language to describe the mathematical community's loss when you left academia. Seems you made quite an impression." A flush of pride warmed David's face, quickly followed by the familiar ache of paths not taken. "She also mentioned," Kaplan continued, "that you had been accepted to 3 top-tier graduate programs before you withdrew from consideration. MIT was among them." David nodded stiffly. Those acceptance letters had arrived during the worst week of his life while he was arranging his father's funeral, helping his mother navigate a healthcare system designed to confuse and exhaust, and trying to explain to his 16-year-old brother why their lives had imploded overnight. "What I want to know, Mr. Chen," Kaplan leaned forward, hands clasped. "On his desk is why you're still here, not just at MIT but in mathematics at all. Most people, forced to abandon a field, move on emotionally as well as practically. They find new interests, new passions. They don't spend their nights secretly solving equations while working security rounds." The question pierced something deep in David, releasing words he hadn't allowed himself to say aloud for years. "Because I can't stop seeing it. The patterns, the structures, they're everywhere. In the architecture of this building, in the flight path of birds outside my window, in the way traffic flows at rush hour." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Mathematics isn't just what I do or did. It's how I understand the world. Taking it away would be like," he gestured helplessly, "like removing a sense. I'd still be alive, but I wouldn't be fully experiencing reality." Kaplan sat back, a flicker of something like satisfaction crossing his features. "Most people view mathematics as a skill or a subject. A select few recognize it as a language. But the truly exceptional, they understand it's a way of seeing." He tapped his fingers on the desk. "You have that vision, Mr. Chen. That's exceedingly rare, and in my experience it can't be taught. You either see the world that way, or you don't." David said nothing, afraid to break whatever spell had brought him to this moment, to this conversation that felt like it was happening in some parallel universe where security guards discussed mathematical theory with renowned professors. Kaplan opened a drawer and withdrew a folder, much thicker than the one David had brought. He placed it on the desk between them. The MIT Pure Mathematics Fellowship I mentioned. Applications closed last month, but as department chair, I have a certain latitude in exceptional circumstances. He slid the folder toward David. Consider this your application package. The committee meets next week. If you're selected, you'd begin the program next semester. Full tuition, as I said, plus a stipend sufficient to live on without the need for outside employment. David stared at the folder, unable to make himself reach for it. Professor Kaplan, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but my situation hasn't changed. My mother still requires expensive care. My brother is in college now, but he depends on my support. The stipend is generous, Mr. Chen. More than your current security position pays, I checked. David's eyebrows rose at that, surprised by the thoroughness of Kaplan's research. Even so, sir, I don't have an undergraduate degree. I'm 3 semesters short. That can be addressed. MIT has provisions for exceptional candidates. Kaplan gestured to the folder again. At least review the materials. The decision is ultimately yours, but don't dismiss this opportunity out of hand because you've grown comfortable with limitations that may no longer apply. Slowly, half expecting the folder to vanish like a mirage, David reached out and took it. The weight of it in his hands felt significant, consequential. Why? He asked finally, looking up at Kaplan. Why would you do this for someone you just met? Someone who was trespassing on university property? Kaplan's expression turned thoughtful. I've been at MIT for 23 years, Mr. Chen. I've taught thousands of students, mentored hundreds of graduates, published dozens of papers that advance my field incrementally. But true mathematical insight, the kind that reshapes understanding rather than simply extending it, that's vanishingly rare. He gestured toward David. Last night, I saw something I haven't seen in a very long time. Pure, intuitive brilliance, applied to a problem without ego or academic posturing, just the clean, elegant pursuit of truth through numbers. He stood, signaling that the meeting was concluding. In simpler terms, mathematics has given me everything I value in my life. I consider it a personal responsibility to nurture exceptional talent when I encounter it, regardless of the unconventional package it comes in. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Now, I believe you have quite a lot of reading to do, and I have a committee to prepare for a rather unusual candidate. David rose, clutching the folder like a lifeline. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Chen. The fellowship is highly competitive, and while I have influence, the decision isn't mine alone. You'll need to be extraordinarily convincing in your interview. As David turned to leave, Kaplan added, and Mr. Chen, if you insist on continuing your security shifts until this is resolved, please refrain from writing on my chalkboards without permission. Next time, come to my office directly. My door is open to serious mathematicians, regardless of their uniform. David nodded, something like a smile tugging at his lips for the first time in longer than he could remember. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As he stepped back into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind him, David clutched the folder against his chest. The corridor seemed different somehow. Not a place he was passing through on his way to somewhere else, but potentially a place where he belonged. He had no guarantees. The fellowship was a long shot. The logistics of returning to academic life after so many years away were daunting. But for the first time since that terrible day when he'd packed away his textbooks and his ambitions, David Chen allowed himself to imagine a different future. One where the midnight equations weren't stolen moments, but the center of his life. Once more, he walked toward the elevator, straightening his shoulders, the folder heavy with possibility in his hands. Whatever happened next, something fundamental had already shifted. He had been seen not just as a security guard, not just as a set of eyes checking locks and doors, but as what he had always been beneath the uniform, a mathematician. David stepped out of Kaplan's office into the bright afternoon sunlight, the weight of the application folder in his hands, feeling both exhilarating and terrifying. The quad was bustling with activity. Students lounging on the grass, professors hurrying between buildings, tour groups following guides who gestured enthusiastically at MIT's architectural landmarks. This world had been just beyond his reach. For years, visible but untouchable, like pressing his face against a shop window to glimpse treasures he could never afford. Now, somehow, the door had cracked open. A brisk December wind cut across campus, and David clutched the folder tighter. As he made his way toward the main gates, he needed time to think, to process. The local cafe across from campus seemed as good a place as any. He found a quiet corner table, ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu, and finally allowed himself to open the folder that might change everything. The application materials were comprehensive and intimidating. Personal statement, research proposal, 3 letters of recommendation, transcripts, sample work demonstrating mathematical proficiency, an invitation to a formal interview with the fellowship committee. David's throat tightened as he read through the requirements. The submission deadline was just 8 days away. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then dialed. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "David, is everything okay? You never called during the day." "Hey, Jorge, everything's fine. Something came up at MIT. I might be home late tonight." His roommate's voice turned curious. "Something good or something bad?" David stared down at the application materials. "I'm not sure yet, but maybe good, really good." After hanging up, David spent the next 3 hours in that cafe, drafting and redrafting his personal statement. How did you compress the journey of the past 8 years into a few concise paragraphs? How did you explain that abandoning a dream didn't mean you stopped loving it, that sometimes walking away was the only responsible choice? That mathematics had remained his secret language, his private solace, even as life pulled him in different directions. The sun was setting by the time David packed up his notes. He had just enough time to grab dinner before his security shift began at 10. The irony wasn't lost on him. He would be patrolling the same halls tonight that might, if the impossible happened, become his academic home. When he arrived at the security office to clock in, his supervisor, Ray, looked up with an expression David couldn't quite read. "Chen, Professor Kaplan called about you today." David's stomach dropped. "Sir, I can explain." Ray held up a hand. "Already taken care of. Your shift schedule's been modified. You're still working nights, but you're reassigned to the mathematics building exclusively. And," he slid a paper across the desk, "you're authorized to use the department's graduate study room during your breaks." Professor Kaplan was quite insistent. David stared at the authorization form, signed by both Kaplan and the head of campus security. Ray's eyes softened slightly. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but Kaplan's not a man who makes requests lightly. Whatever opportunity you've got, don't waste it." That night, David's patrol felt different. The hallways he'd walked 1,000 times before seemed charged with new potential. During his break, he slipped into the graduate study room, a comfortable space with well-worn armchairs, extensive bookshelves, and a large table scattered with mathematical journals. It was empty this late, and David moved through it like someone exploring a sacred space, running his fingers along book spines, taking in titles of recent publications. On the table lay an open notebook with calculations for what appeared to be someone's thesis work. David didn't touch it, but he recognized the approach, a promising but flawed attempt to extend a theorem in topological data analysis, without Thinking, he jotted down a quick note on his own paper, a potential solution to the mathematical dead end the student had reached. He left it on the table beside the notebook, unsigned, just a small mathematical gift from one researcher to another. It felt good to participate, even in this small, anonymous way, in the academic conversation that had continued without him all these years. The next morning, David woke early, despite having worked until dawn. He couldn't afford to waste a minute. The fellowship application loomed, an Everest to be climbed in just over a week. He spent the day at the public library, hunched over one of their computers, drafting his research proposal. This, at least, came more naturally. In the empty hours, between shifts, in the quiet moments before sleep, his mind had never stopped working on mathematical problems. He had notebooks filled with ideas, approaches, extensions to existing theories that he'd developed in isolation with no one to share them with. Now, those private explorations might have value beyond his own intellectual satisfaction. His proposal took shape quickly, an innovative approach to computational topology that bridged pure mathematics with practical applications in data science. It was the kind of work that had always fascinated him, living at the intersection of abstract beauty and real-world relevance. By day 3, David had a draft of both his personal statement and research proposal. What he didn't have were the required letters of recommendation. Professor Ruiz from Michigan might write one, based on Kaplan's conversation with her, but that still left 2 more. Who would vouch for the mathematical abilities of a security guard 8 years removed from academia? That evening, David arrived at his shift to find a note waiting for him at the security desk. My office, 11 p.m. Kaplan. At precisely 11, David knocked on the professor's door, surprised to find lights still on. Kaplan wasn't alone. A younger man sat in one of the visitor chairs, twirling a pen between his fingers with the casual dexterity of someone who spent too much time thinking and not enough moving. Mr. Chen, Kaplan gestured him in. This is Dr. Marcus Wei, our newest faculty member in applied topology. I've been telling him about your, unconventional situation. Dr. Wei studied David with open curiosity. He couldn't have been much older than David himself, perhaps early 30s, with the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who prioritized equations over sleep. Professor Kaplan tells me you solved the Brenner constraint problem, Wei said without preamble. I've been stuck on a similar issue in my own research. Would you mind taking a look? David glanced at Kaplan, who nodded almost imperceptibly. For the next hour, David found himself engaged in the most stimulating mathematical discussion he'd had in years. Wei's problem was elegant and challenging, dealing with persistence in topological data structures. David didn't solve it outright. It was far too complex for an hour's conversation, but he offered several promising approaches, drawing diagrams on Kaplan's whiteboard as Wei asked increasingly specific questions. When they finally paused, we sat back, a look of satisfaction on his face. Well, he said to Kaplan, you weren't exaggerating. He turned to David. I'd be happy to write one of your recommendation letters, and I'd like to share some of my recent papers with you. If you're interested, your perspective might be valuable. After Wei left, Kaplan fixed David with his penetrating gaze. That's 2 letters secured. I've taken the liberty of contacting Dr. Eliana Ruiz. She's agreed to provide the 3rd. David blinked. You've been arranging all this? Why? Kaplan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Because talent like yours is rare, Mr. Chen, and because I've spent too many years watching academia become increasingly homogeneous, students following identical paths, thinking identical thoughts, too afraid of failure to take intellectual risks. He gestured toward the door where Wei had exited. Marcus recognized your ability immediately without knowing your background. That's the purest form of mathematical evaluation. The committee might not agree, David said quietly. Some won't, Kaplan acknowledged. But not all decisions at MIT are made by committee consensus. Sometimes a strong enough advocate can tip the scales. A small, sharp smile appeared. I can be quite persuasive when motivated. The next few days passed in a blur of writing, revising, and unexpected encounters. Word seemed to have spread among certain faculty members that Kaplan had discovered a mathematical prodigy disguised as security personnel. During his shifts, David found himself approached by curious professors who happened to be working late, each with a mathematical puzzle or problem they wanted to discuss. Some were clearly testing him, skeptical of Kaplan's claims. Others seemed genuinely interested in his perspective. David met each interaction with the same quiet focus, neither apologizing for his unusual path nor attempting to oversell his abilities. The equations spoke for themselves. By the application deadline, David had assembled a package that reflected both his unconventional journey and his undeniable talent. His personal statement spoke honestly about the circumstances that had derailed, his education, and the persistence that had kept his mathematical mind sharp despite everything. His research proposal integrated ideas he'd developed in isolation with current academic discourse, creating something genuinely innovative. The 3 recommendation letters from Kaplan Way and his former advisor Dr. Ruiz provided academic legitimacy to his application. He submitted everything online from a computer in the mathematics department's graduate lounge, where Kaplan had arranged for him to have temporary access privileges. As he clicked the final submit button, David felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. For 8 years, he had carefully managed his expectations, shut down hope, accepted limitations. Now he had allowed himself to want something that seemed impossible. Just 2 weeks ago, the potential for disappointment was enormous. The next phase was waiting. The fellowship committee would review applications over the following week, conduct interviews with finalists, and announce decisions by the end of the month. David threw himself into preparation for the interview he might never get, reviewing current literature, solving practice problems, even asking Jorge to conduct mock interviews, where he justified his unusual background. "You know," Jorge said after one particularly intense session, "I've lived with you for 3 years, and I've never seen you like this. It's like you've woken up." David paused, realizing the truth in his roommate's words. "I guess I have been on autopilot for a while." "Try 8 years, Jorge corrected. "Ever since I've known you, you've been this quiet guy who works too much, sleeps too little, and spends his free time scribbling in notebooks instead of actually living." He gestured to the mathematical papers spread across their small dining table. "This is the first time I've seen you actually want something." The interview invitation came 5 days after submission, an email that appeared on David's phone while he was in the middle of his security rounds. The fellowship committee would see him on Friday at 2 p.m., exactly 1 week away. The message was brief and formal, giving no indication of his chances. David's preparation intensified. He continued his security shifts. He couldn't afford to quit before anything was certain. But every other waking moment was devoted to preparation. He reviewed his research proposal until he could explain every aspect in precise detail. He anticipated potential questions about his unorthodox background and practiced addressing them directly without defensiveness. Professor Kaplan made himself available for a mock interview, bringing in 2 colleagues to simulate the committee experience. Their questions were probing, sometimes uncomfortable, forcing David to justify not only his mathematical ideas, but his very presence in the applicant pool. "Why should we select someone without a completed undergraduate degree when we have fully qualified candidates?" one professor asked bluntly. "Because formal education doesn't always measure true mathematical ability," David replied, finding confidence in the truth of his words. "My circumstances changed. but my capacity for original mathematical thought didn't. I've continued to engage with cutting-edge concepts despite working full-time in an unrelated field. That persistence demonstrates both ability and dedication that transcends conventional credentials. The night before his interview, David couldn't sleep. He paced the small confines of his bedroom, mind racing through all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. What if the committee saw only his incomplete degree, his years away from formal academia? What if they decided his unusual path was too risky? For their prestigious fellowship, at 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep entirely. He dressed quietly and walked to campus, using his security badge to enter the mathematics building. The familiar routine of his security rounds had always calmed him, and tonight he needed that steadiness more than ever. The building was silent and dark, his footsteps echoing in empty corridors. David found himself drawn to room 456 again, Kaplan's classroom where everything had changed just 2 weeks ago. The door was unlocked, the boards clean and waiting for tomorrow's lectures. David picked up a piece of chalk, feeling its weight in his hand. Without really planning what he would write, he began to work through a problem. Not one of the prepared examples he'd practiced for his interview, but something personal, a mathematical question that had intrigued him for years. Time dissolved as he filled the board with elegant notation, following a thread of logic that unwound with increasing beauty. This was why he had never been able to abandon mathematics, even when life had forced him from its formal study. In these symbols and structures, he found a clarity and harmony that existed nowhere else in his experience. Still solving equations in the middle of the night, I see. David turned to find Professor Kaplan in the doorway, looking unsurprised, to discover his security guard filling chalkboards at 4 a.m. I couldn't sleep, David admitted. Kaplan nodded, entering the room and studying David's work with interest. Pre-interview jitters are normal, even for traditional candidates. He pointed to a section of the board. That approach is particularly elegant. Is this related to your proposal? David shook his head. Just something I've been thinking about for a while, a problem I keep coming back to. The best mathematics often comes from those persistent questions we can't let go of, Kaplan observed. He turned to face David directly. You've done everything possible to prepare. Now you need to trust that the committee will recognize what I saw that first night. And if they don't, David asked quietly. Then we find another path, Kaplan said simply. Talent like yours always finds its way forward eventually. The question is just how many unnecessary obstacles will be placed in its path. The morning of the interview dawned bright and cold. David had gone home briefly to shower and change into the one good suit he owned, purchased years ago for his father's funeral and rarely worn since. It was slightly loose now, a silent testament to the years of working multiple jobs with little time for regular meals. Jorge had left a good luck note on the kitchen counter, along with a protein bar and a banana. Brain food, the note read. Go get a math genius. David arrived at the mathematics department 30 minutes early, too anxious to wait any longer at home. The interview would take place in the department's conference room, a formal space with a long oak table and portraits of mathematical luminaries lining the walls. He sat on a bench in the hallway outside, reviewing his notes one final time, trying to control the rapid beating of his heart. At precisely 1:55 p.m., the door opened and a department administrator appeared. Mr. Chen, the committee is ready for you. David stood, straightened his tie, and walked into the room with as much confidence as he could muster. 7 people sat around the table. Kaplan at one end, Dr. Wei among them, the others unfamiliar faces wearing expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. David Chen, Kaplan began formally. Thank you for joining us today. As you know, the MIT Pure Mathematics Fellowship is highly competitive, with an unusual number of qualified applicants this year. He gestured to the group. Each member of this committee has reviewed your application materials thoroughly. We have some questions about both your research proposal and your unique background. What followed was the most intellectually rigorous 2 hours of David's life. The questions came rapid fire, challenging every aspect of his mathematical thinking, probing for weaknesses in his understanding, demanding justifications for his approaches. They pushed him far beyond his prepared answers, forcing real-time, problem-solving and theoretical leaps. One silver-haired woman, whom David later learned was Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the most senior member of the committee, was particularly relentless. Your approach to the third corollary seems intuitive rather than rigorous, she noted critically. Walk us through your formal proof step by step. David took a deep breath and began working through the mathematical logic, writing on the whiteboard as he explained his reasoning. Halfway through, he hesitated, recognizing a potential flaw in his argument. "Wait," he said, studying what he'd written. "That's not quite right." He erased a section and began again, rethinking the approach in real time. "If we consider instead a neighborhood defined by..." For several tense minutes, he worked through the problem while the committee watched in silence. Finally, he stepped back from the board. "There, that addresses the discontinuity issue properly." Dr. Hayes nodded, a flicker of something that might have been approval crossing her features. "You caught your own error and corrected it. More impressive than getting it right the first time." The technical questions eventually gave way to more personal ones, equally challenging in their own way. "Mr. Chen," one committee member asked, "given your extended absence from formal academic training, how can we be confident you'll successfully transition back into a rigorous research environment?" "I've never actually left that environment," David responded quietly. "I've maintained rigorous self-study throughout these years, following current journal publications and continuing my own research in whatever time I could find. The difference is that now I'm seeking the community and resources to develop those ideas fully, rather than in isolation." "And why should MIT invest in you, rather than a candidate with more traditional qualifications?" another asked bluntly. David met the question directly. "Because I bring both technical ability and a perspective most traditional candidates don't have. Mathematical insight doesn't only flourish in conventional settings, sometimes the very constraints of an unconventional path force innovative thinking." He gestured to his research proposal. "The approach I've outlined here emerged precisely because I was working outside traditional academic frameworks, without the unconscious limitations that sometimes come with them." As the interview neared its conclusion, Kaplan asked the final question. "Mr. Chen, if awarded this fellowship, what do you hope to contribute to the mathematical community?" David paused, considering. "Mathematics changed my life, even when circumstances forced me away from its formal study. It gave me a language to understand the world when everything else was chaos. What I hope to contribute is not just new theorems or proofs, though I believe I can deliver those. I want to help build bridges between abstract mathematical beauty and practical human needs." He looked around the table, meeting each gaze directly. "And perhaps show that there are many paths to mathematical insight, not all of them straight or conventional." When he finally stepped out of the conference room, David felt drained, yet exhilarated. He had held his own. Whether it would be enough, he couldn't say, but he had represented himself and his abilities honestly. Kaplan followed him into the hallway. "The committee will deliberate now. We should have a decision by early next week." His expression gave nothing away. "Whatever happens, Mr. Chen, remember that today you proved you belong in this conversation. No one can take that away from you." The next 3 days were among the longest of David's life. He continued his security shifts, patrolling the same hallways where his future might unfold, or might remain forever just out of reach. During breaks, he found himself drawn to the graduate study room, where he would sit quietly, absorbing the academic atmosphere, allowing himself to imagine a different life. On the third night after his interview, something unexpected happened. As David made his rounds through the mathematics building, he noticed light spilling from beneath the door of the graduate lounge. It was nearly 2 a.m., unusual for anyone to be working so late, even by MIT standards. He knocked softly and opened the door, expecting to find a student who had fallen asleep over their work. Instead, he found 5 graduate students very much awake, huddled around a whiteboard covered in equations. They looked up in surprise at his entrance. "Sorry," one of them said, a young woman with tired eyes and a coffee-stained sweatshirt. "Are we not supposed to be here this late?" "It's fine," David assured them, recognizing his security uniform. "Must be the cause of their concern. Just checking everything's okay." He was about to continue his rounds when another student spoke up. "Wait, are you David Chen?" David stared in surprise. "Yes, how did you know my name?" The students exchanged glances. "You're kind of famous in the department right now," the woman explained. "The security guard who impressed Kaplan enough to get a fellowship interview. Plus, someone's been leaving really helpful notes on people's work in here late at night." She gestured to the whiteboard. "We're stuck on this problem for Professor Wei's advanced seminar. Any chance you'd take a look before continuing your rounds?" David hesitated, then set down his flashlight. "I have about 15 minutes before I need to check the next building." Those 15 minutes turned into 45 as David worked through the problem with the students, guiding rather than solving, asking questions that helped them see new approaches. By the time he reluctantly left to continue his rounds, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from frustration to excitement. The problem nearly cracked. "You should be teaching this stuff, not checking doors," one student said as David prepared to leave. "Maybe someday," David replied, allowing himself a small smile. The fellowship decision came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after his interview. David was asleep after his night shift when his phone rang, jolting him awake. Kaplan's name flashed on the screen. David's hand trembled slightly as he answered. "Professor Kaplan, Mr. Chen." Kaplan's voice gave nothing away. "The committee has reached its decision. Can you come to my office this afternoon, say 2 o'clock? "Yes, sir," David managed, heart pounding. "I'll be there." The hours until the meeting stretched endlessly. David showered, dressed in his best clothes again, and walked to campus with a sense of both dread and hope warring in his chest. Whatever happened today, his life had already changed in ways he couldn't have imagined just weeks ago. He had allowed himself to want something, again, to reach for something beyond survival. Regardless of the committee's decision, that itself was a kind of victory. At exactly 2 o'clock, David knocked on Kaplan's office door. When he entered, he was surprised to find not just Kaplan, but Dr. Wei and Dr. Hayes as well, all three watching him with unreadable expressions. "David Chen," Kaplan began formally, "we've asked you here to discuss the committee's decision regarding your fellowship application." David stood straight, bracing himself for whatever came next. Dr. Hayes spoke next, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Your application was unconventional, to say the least. Your academic background is incomplete, your professional experience entirely irrelevant to mathematics, and your research proposal ambitious to the point of audacity." David's heart sank, but he maintained his composure, nodding slightly in acknowledgement of these facts. "However," she continued, "your interview was among the most impressive I've witnessed in 30 years on this committee. You demonstrated not only technical proficiency, but intellectual creativity and the rare ability to recognize and correct your own errors in real time." David barely dared to breathe. Kaplan picked up a folder from his desk. The committee vote was not unanimous, which is unusual for our selection process. There were legitimate concerns about precedent and qualifications. A small smile appeared. But in the end, mathematics itself made the most compelling argument. Talent of your caliber simply cannot be ignored, regardless of its unconventional packaging. Dr. Wei stepped forward, extending his hand. Congratulations, David. The fellowship is yours, if you still want it. For a moment, David couldn't speak, couldn't move. The words seemed to hang in the air, too monumental to fully absorb. Then slowly, he reached out and shook Wei's offered hand. Thank you, he managed finally. I won't waste this opportunity. See that you don't, Dr. Hayes said, though her severe expression had softened slightly. We've bent several rules to make this happen. Your success or failure will impact how the department evaluates non-traditional candidates in the future. There are some conditions, Kaplan added, sliding the folder across his desk. You'll need to complete certain undergraduate requirements. Concurrently with your graduate work, it will mean a heavier course load initially, and we'll be assigning you a faculty mentoring committee to ensure your transition back to academic life goes smoothly. David nodded, willing to accept any conditions. When would I start? The spring semester begins January 18th, Kaplan replied. Your security position has already been notified of your resignation, effective January 1st, which gives you 2 weeks to prepare. The fellowship stipend will be processed immediately, so you needn't worry about the financial gap. As the reality began to sink in, David felt a surge of emotions he couldn't fully name. Gratitude, validation, and beneath it all, a quiet vindication. The path that had seemed permanently closed had suddenly reopened, not despite his unconventional journey, but in some ways because of it. One more thing, Dr. Wei added with a smile. Those graduate students you helped the other night, they've requested you as a teaching assistant for next semester's advanced topology seminar. Apparently, you explained concepts more clearly in 45 minutes than I managed in 2 weeks of lectures. For the first time since entering the office, David smiled fully. I'd be honored. As he left the mathematics building that afternoon, fellowship acceptance papers in hand, David paused to look back at the imposing structure that had been both his workplace and his secret academic home these past years. Soon, he would walk through its doors, not as someone invisible, checking locks and patrolling empty hallways, but as a recognized member of its intellectual community. The security badge clipped to his belt caught the winter sunlight. David unclipped it, running his thumb over the worn plastic. He wouldn't need it much longer, but he decided he would keep it, a reminder of the path he had traveled, of the persistence that had brought him, against all odds, back to mathematics. That night, David called his mother to share the news. As he described the fellowship, the stipend, the opportunity to finally complete the journey he had abandoned 8 years ago, he heard her begin to cry softly. "Mum, please don't cry," he said. "This is good news." "I know," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm crying because your father would have been so proud. He always said you had a special mind." Later, as David began packing up the small apartment he shared with Jorge, sorting through years of accumulated notebooks filled with equations and ideas, he came across something he had forgotten: his original MIT graduate program acceptance letter from 8 years ago. The one he had never been able to accept. He placed it side by side with his new fellowship letter, the impossible circle somehow completed. The journey ahead would not be easy. He had years of formal education to catch up on, academic politics to navigate, and the weight of expectations, both his own and others, to bear. But as he carefully packed his mathematical notebooks in preparation for his new life, David felt a certainty that had been absent for too long. He belonged in this world of numbers and proofs, of theorems and conjectures. He always had. And now, finally, the world had recognized it too. MIT professor caught the security guard solving equations at 3 a.m. The finale. 5 years had passed since that fateful night when Professor Kaplan discovered David Chen solving complex equations on a chalkboard during his security rounds. The mathematics building at MIT looked the same from the outside, imposing stone architecture, windows reflecting the golden afternoon light. But for David, everything else had transformed. He stood now at the front of Lecture Hall 370, adjusting. His collar as students filed in for the first session of advanced computational topology. Some carried coffee, others laptops, all of them unaware that their professor had once patrolled these same halls with a flashlight and keyring rather than lecture notes and academic credentials. "Good morning," David began, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves. "I'm Dr. Chen, and this is going to be an unconventional course." He smiled slightly at the understatement. "We'll be exploring the intersection of abstract mathematical structures and practical applications, finding the hidden shapes in data that tell us how complex systems truly behave." From the back of the room, David spotted Professor Kaplan slipping in quietly, taking a seat at the far corner with a small nod of acknowledgement. The gesture wasn't lost on David. This moment represented a completed circle, a journey neither of them could have fully imagined that night 5 years ago. The path to this podium had been neither straight nor easy. After the unexpected collaborative grant with Thomas Whitman, a partnership that had begun with mutual wariness and gradually evolved into genuine intellectual respect, David's career had accelerated in unexpected ways. Their paper combining Thomas's theoretical rigor with David's innovative applications had garnered attention far beyond MIT, challenging conventional boundaries between pure and applied mathematics. David's doctoral dissertation, completed in record time despite his unconventional background, had introduced a new framework for analyzing complex systems using topological invariants. The approach had applications ranging from urban planning to network security, drawing interest from both academic institutions and industry leaders. "Mathematics isn't just about abstract beauty," David continued, writing a simple equation on the board. "Though there's plenty of that," he turned back to face the class, "it's also about seeing patterns that others miss, about finding structure in what appears to be chaos." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Dr. Chen, I read your paper on topological data analysis in urban environments. Is it true that you developed that framework while working as a security guard?" The question no longer made David uncomfortable. He had long since stopped feeling defensive about his unusual path, had come to recognize it as a source of strength rather than shame. "That's right," he replied. "Sometimes the most interesting mathematical insights come from unexpected places. In my case, years of observing how people, information and resources flow through complex institutional spaces gave me a perspective I might never have developed through traditional training alone." He didn't elaborate further, but the story was well known in mathematical circles by now. The security guard who had transformed from curiosity to rising star, who had published groundbreaking papers while still completing his degree, who had turned down lucrative industry offers to remain in academia, where he could mentor others from non-traditional backgrounds. After class, Kaplan approached, his silver hair now fully white but his eyes as sharp as ever. "Not bad for a first lecture," he commented dryly, "though you might have mentioned the historical antecedents to your central theorem." David smiled at the familiar critiquing tone. "Saving those for Wednesday, Professor. Have to give them a reason to come back." Kaplan nodded, then gestured toward the window where afternoon sun illuminated the campus quad. "Join me for coffee? There's something we should discuss." They walked to the small campus cafe where, 5 years earlier, David had sat alone with his fellowship application, wondering if he was chasing an impossible dream. Now the baristas greeted him by name, already preparing his usual order. "The Dean is assembling a special committee," Kaplan said once they were seated, "focused on identifying mathematical talent from non-traditional pathways. Given your unique perspective, they'd like you to chair it." David stirred his coffee, considering the proposal. "Is this a genuine initiative or just institutional image polishing?" "Both, undoubtedly," Kaplan replied with characteristic bluntness. "But the former doesn't negate the value of the latter. Your story has already inspired changes in how we evaluate applicants. This would formalize and expand those efforts." Through the cafe window, David watched students crossing the quad, some hurrying to class, others lounging on the grass, all of them moving through their academic lives with the confidence of belonging. He thought about how many brilliant minds might never enter these spaces because of circumstances similar to his own. Financial pressures, family responsibilities, educational gaps, and how many unique perspectives might remain undiscovered. "I'll do it," he said, "but I want real resources behind it. Scholarships, mentoring structures, concrete pathways, not just aspirational rhetoric." Kaplan's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "I told the dean you'd say exactly that. The initial funding is already secured, details to be determined by the committee chair." That evening, David walked through campus toward the small apartment he now rented near the mathematics building. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights, and he found himself following the old security patrol route out of habit, a ghost path from his former life. Near the northwest corner of the building, he noticed a figure hunched over. A maintenance cart, a middle-aged woman in the gray uniform of the campus facilities staff, checking items off a clipboard inventory. "Evening," David said as he approached. She looked up, startled. "Oh, good evening, Professor." The assumption of his role felt both strange and natural. To her, he was simply another faculty member, his previous identity invisible. "Everything going all right?" "Yes, sir," she replied, then hesitated. "Actually, I was wondering about the night classes." "Night classes?" "The extension school," she clarified. "I've been looking at the mathematics program, been trying to teach myself some of it, but it's hard without proper instruction." She gestured vaguely toward the building. "My daughter's good with numbers, really good. But we can't afford a regular college path right now." David felt something shift in his chest, a door opening to a room he recognized intimately. "What's your name?" "Maria Vasquez." "Maria, I actually know quite a bit about the extension school. Maybe I can help. Does your daughter have any examples of her work?" Maria's expression brightened. "She keeps notebooks full of problems she solves. Been doing it since she was 12. Now she's 18 and still working as a waitress. Because we can't afford college, but she never stops with the numbers." David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Still a novelty to him, having his name preceded by Dr. E and followed by his faculty position. "Have her email me some of her work. I'll see what I can do." Maria took the card carefully, as if it might dissolve between her fingers. "Thank you, Professor, but why would you help?" David smiled. "Because someone once did the same for me when I was a security guard solving equations at 3 a.m., thinking no one would ever notice." Her eyes widened with sudden recognition. "You're that security guard, the one they talk about. I thought it was just a department legend." "Not a legend," David replied, "just someone who got a chance they didn't expect." 2 weeks later, David sat in his office reviewing application materials for the new Pathways to Mathematics program, the initiative he had agreed to chair. The first scholarship would be awarded next semester, providing full tuition and a stipend to a promising student from a non-traditional background. Maria's daughter Elena was among the applicants, her self-taught mathematical insights showing remarkable originality despite gaps in formal training. A knock at his door interrupted his review. Thomas Whitman entered, now an associate professor himself. Their early antagonism long since evolved into a productive, if occasionally prickly, collegiality. "The committee voted unanimously to approve your proposal," Thomas announced without preamble. 6 scholarships instead of the original 3, plus the mentoring structure and summer bridge program. David looked up in surprise. "I expected pushback on the budget." Thomas shrugged. "Your presentation was persuasive, and the Byrne Foundation matched the department funding after they saw our preliminary results." He hesitated, then added, "I may have also emphasized that identifying mathematical talent wherever it exists is in everyone's interest, even those of us who came through traditional channels." It was perhaps the clearest acknowledgement Thomas had ever made of how his view had shifted over the years, from seeing David as an affront to academic standards, to recognizing the value of diverse pathways into mathematics. "Thank you," David said simply. Thomas nodded once, businesslike. "The Unified Topology Seminar starts next week. Hayes is expecting both of us to present the latest findings." After Thomas left, David returned to the application materials, but his thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the night Kaplan had discovered him, the fear and hope that had battled within him as his secret. Mathematical life was suddenly exposed. He remembered the struggles of those early semesters, the isolation and doubt, the moments when the gap between his background and his aspirations had seemed insurmountable. But he also remembered the gradual integration, the formation of his study group, the first time a professor had cited his work in a lecture. He remembered the day his mother had attended his PhD defense, tears in her eyes as committee members, addressed her son as a colleague rather than a curiosity. He remembered his brother's graduation from college, made possible by the financial stability David's fellowship and subsequent faculty position had provided their family. David's phone buzzed with a message from Maria Vasquez. "Elena finished the problem set you gave her. She says there's a mistake in the third equation. Is that true?" He smiled. There was indeed a deliberate error he had included as a test. Few undergraduates would have caught it. Later that night, David found himself drawn back to room 456, the classroom, where everything had changed. It was empty now, the boards clean, waiting for tomorrow's lessons. He picked up a piece of chalk, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote a single equation on the board, not something complex or impressive, but the elegantly simple expression of a fundamental relationship between form and function that had been the core of his dissertation. Beneath it, he added, "Look for patterns others miss. They might change your life." He didn't sign it, didn't need to. Instead, he placed the chalk carefully back in its tray and turned toward the door, nearly colliding with a young security guard making his rounds. "Sorry, Professor Chen," the guard said, stepping back quickly. "Didn't know anyone was still here." "Just finishing up," David replied. "Everything quiet tonight?" "Yes, sir. Pretty normal night." The guard glanced curiously at the equation on the board, but said nothing further. As David walked past him toward the door, he hesitated, then turned back. "You know, the graduate lounge is open all night, and they have much better coffee than the security office." The guard looked confused. "Sir? Just saying, if you ever need a place to study during your breaks, no one would mind." "Oh." The guard seemed surprised by the unusual offer from a faculty member. "Thank you, sir." David nodded and continued down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building. Behind him, he left not just an equation, but a door slightly ajar. The same door Kaplan had once opened for him, a passage between worlds that seemed separate but needn't be. Outside, the MIT campus spread before him, buildings illuminated against the night sky. From security guard to professor, from outsider to bridge builder, the journey had not been what he expected when he first took that night shift job to support his family. But then, the most elegant mathematical solutions often emerged from unexpected starting points. David looked up at the stars, the eternal patterns that had fascinated mathematicians since humans first traced constellations across the heavens. Not all who could read those patterns had the privilege of formal study, but their insights were no less valuable for taking unconventional paths. His task now was to help others find their way through those same doors that had opened for him, to ensure that brilliant minds would be recognized, whatever uniform they might wear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.